Why are we here? Why am I up here? So we are here because today is the federal holiday called Juneteenth. Who here knows that today is Juneteenth? All right, outstanding, outstanding. We're off to a great start already. So now we're gonna learn a little bit more about it, but I'm gonna take you on a little journey. We're gonna go way back to the beginning of this thing and try to bring us up to understand why we still celebrate this as Americans today. So I want to emphasize that although as a nation, we are only celebrating the third year of this recognition of Juneteenth, our newest national holiday known as Juneteenth, National Independence Day. But it is actually the 159th celebration of Juneteenth in the African American community. We're here today to gain hopefully a fuller understanding of why all freedom-loving Americans should celebrate Juneteenth. So today, I want to frame this conversation from the vantage point of what I call the 5 stages from slavery to Juneteenth and beyond. And I think you're going to leave here today with a few surprises that you didn't expect to hear. So that first stage of the African Odyssey is what we know of as the transatlantic slave trade. We've all heard of that in school. It brought thousands of African Americans into the Americas. But that particular stage has 3 different parts that I want to talk to you about. The first stage of that, the first part of that 3 stages, happens on the continent of Africa. And sadly, what a lot of people don't understand or don't talk about is the fact it was Africans themselves that were capturing other Africans and selling them to European nations. It was not white people going to Africa kidnapping black people. The Africans themselves were kidnapping each other, usually through wars and conflict, and selling them to European nations. So that's a big part of that in the beginning. So during the second part of that first stage is when you have what we know of as the Middle Passage. In the Middle Passage, I might have to move from this amplifier or something, because I'm getting a lot of feedback over here. I don't know if it's me or what. Y'all hear that? If you can hear me, then it's okay. I'll lose hearing in this ear just for you. Just for you. Okay, so in that second part, known as the Middle Passage, the enslaved were transported across the Atlantic Ocean. It took usually about 2.5 months to make that terrible journey. The crews would pack enslaved Africans onto a ship so tight that they didn't have space to sit up. They didn't have space to move around. There was no ventilation. There was no sufficient water. And of course, the ship didn't exactly have restrooms. So these enslaved Africans had to lay in their own human waste for days at a time. And about 15 to 20% of them died along that passage. Death on that trip was so frequent that every slave ship was trailed by sharks, because those sharks knew that they would be well fed if they followed those slave ships. The captives died at a very, very high rate. The third part of that first stage occurred when they arrived at ports in places like Charleston. They were, let me wait, let the train horn go by for a minute. So if y'all forgive me, I'm gonna do a cheap plug real quick. At the Summerville Museum, we do a lecture on Summerville history the 3rd Sunday of every month. And our August history lesson is on the beginnings of the train system coming through Summerville. So how's that for a plug? Right? So I appreciate the train system coming through and giving me the opportunity to advertise our August lecture. So that ought to be fun. Next month's lecture is actually about the beginning of Summerville. So if you want to learn the origin of Summerville, that's going to be our July lecture. So I think it's quite enough for me to kind of keep going here. So as I was saying, the third part of that first stage of the transatlantic slave trade was when they arrived at ports in the Americas. And when they arrived here, for instance, the first thing they did, they were quarantined them. And where did they quarantine them here? They quarantined them on Sullivan Island. They had what they called pest houses on Sullivan Island, and that's where they would house those newly arrived enslaved people to make sure they didn't have lice or any other diseases before they were bringing them into Charleston proper. But once they arrived in the city, then they would be resold to local planters in the area. And that's when that last part of their journey would actually begin. Some of them were chained together and walked to plantations here in South Carolina, but others were chained together and were moved as far away as Florida and Georgia. So you can imagine how long it would take, chained together with 20 other men, to walk from here to Georgia to go to your new plantation. So that was what I call the first stage of this particular journey. In stage 2 of our 5 stages from slavery to Juneteenth and beyond, we look at the years between the start of slavery and the U.S. Civil War. Although our history books don't tell us this, those enslaved Africans, they didn't get off of the boat saying, yes, master, I's gonna do it. That didn't happen. But you don't hear those stories. You don't hear the fact that there were over 800 slave rebellions in the United States. You don't get to hear about that. They fought back. They didn't just sit there and take it. And 2 of the most famous happened right here, locally, with the Stonewall Rebellion in downtown Charleston, and then you have the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion, which never actually happened because they were snitched on by some fellow enslaved laborers, resulting in 34 people, including Denmark-Vesey, being hanged in downtown Charleston for their planned rebellion. But this fight for freedom of the enslaved people moved from what were considered illegal rebellions to a legal way to fight for freedom. And that legal way to fight for freedom came with the Militia Act, which was part of the Emancipation Proclamation, which allowed African Americans to join the Union Army. So you can imagine they would not have had a very difficult time recruiting. Hey, if I give you a gun, I'm gonna let you shoot slave owners. Sign me up. So it should not surprise you that 180,000 African Americans jumped to the front of the line and said, give me a gun. It's my turn now. Representing 10% of that Union Army eventually. Now we have a lot of local history with the connection to some of these, what they called United States colored troops at that time. Even the famous 54th Massachusetts was here in Charleston for their famous raid on Battery Wagner on Morris Island. If you ever seen the movie Glory, at the end of that movie they talk about that famous raid, and that happened right here in Charleston on Morris Island. You also had the 55th Massachusetts, and they liberated the slaves of Goose Creek. And then you also had the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. Those were an interesting group. They were actually, I guess you can call them an illegal military, because the Union general came down, went out to St. Helena Island, grabbed 500 enslaved and formerly enslaved people, and formed an army in 1862 before it was legal for the Union to have black troops. And they raided places in Georgia and South Carolina, things of that nature. But right here in Summerville, South Carolina, you had the 35th United States Colored Troops stationed here in Summerville, South Carolina. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Bacon's Bridge. Well, at the end of the Civil War, it was the 35th United States Colored Troops that rebuilt Bacon's Bridge after the war. So you have a lot of history right here with United States Colored Troops. And so throughout history, we've celebrated emancipation and freedom from others, but in the African American community, we're quick to celebrate the fact that we did a lot to emancipate ourselves. We didn't sit around just waiting for somebody else to do it. Now this brings me to my 3rd stage of the 5 stages from slavery to Juneteenth and beyond. This one covers from the Emancipation Proclamation, which a lot of people get wrong, to what we celebrate nationwide today as Juneteenth, National Independence Day. So what is Juneteenth all about? Why do we celebrate it? Why do we call it by its many names? Juneteenth, Emancipation Day, Jubilee Day, Freedom Day, and now we have the Juneteenth National Independence Day, that law that was signed by President Biden, recognizing it as a national holiday. So for me, the true essence of Juneteenth is the fact that slavery did not end with the Emancipation Proclamation. January 1st, 1863, Lincoln said all the slaves are free in those states that are rebelling against America. The South ignored him. Why? You ain't my president. Jefferson Davis is my president. I don't have to listen to you. So really the Emancipation Proclamation didn't do much for the enslaved except to allow them to join the Union Army. Slavery also didn't end with the Confederate surrenders in April of 1865 at Appomattox. It didn't end with the surrender of troops in North Carolina in Burns, North Carolina, at Bennett Place. Didn't end there. Slavery did not truly end in the United States until the last enslaved African was set free. And we started on that road. That path really began with what we're here to celebrate today, what we call Juneteenth. It happened on June 19th. That's where the word Juneteenth comes from. June 19th. That's where we get the word Juneteenth. So on June 19th, 1865, in Galveston, Texas, on that date, Union General Gordon Granger led thousands of troops, many of them United States colored troops, into Galveston, Texas to announce that, hey, they didn't tell y'all, y'all free. Y'all not supposed to be working here for free. They never told y'all that. You're supposed to be out of here. So there was 250,000 enslaved Africans still working after the Civil War, after the Emancipation Proclamation in Texas, because their owners, of course, never acknowledged it, never let them know, until the Union Army came and forcibly liberated them. General Granger read the following proclamation to the enslaved and their enslavers. I'm going to read for you exactly what he read to them. The people of Texas are informed that according with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and the rights of property between former masters and slaves, and a connection heretofore exists between them, between that of employer and hired laborer. Minds are instantly blown. You've been an enslaved African for 80 years. Now, you have this major mind shift. How do you go from saying, yes, I'm master, to the next day saying, yo, where's my paycheck? Imagine what that took. How did that actually happen? Well, it didn't happen overnight. You can imagine that. And the ideal that people just ran off to the north as soon as slavery was over, that's not true either. That couldn't be further from the truth. The vast majority of them remained right here in the South. Now why? Why didn't they just run off to the north? The answer is really quite simple. They just asked themselves a simple question. What's in the north? I don't know. Do they have a job for me there? I don't know. So most of them stayed right here, and finding family became their main priority. Where do you find your family members? That is the beginning of black family reunions. Black family reunions was begun by trying to bring people together with the same last name if they could find them, and I'll explain that, to try to find mama who was sold down south, and daddy who was sold away, or kids who was sold to different plantations. Finding family was made more difficult because many of them changed their names. The master's name was usually adopted because it was the easiest, but many refused to take on the master's name. Some would use the name of their last plantation to make it easier to find family members. So if you were on the Morningstar plantation, you became Robert Morningstar. So then when you have that Morningstar family reunion, you know if you ever worked on a Morningstar plantation, go there, you might find your relatives. That was the beginning of those family reunions, which we still do today. So looking directly at Juneteenth, let's look at the Juneteenth flag, and that's what that is behind me, officially called the Emancipation Day flag. It has four main parts. The first part I want you to look at is the fact that it's red, white, and blue. That was their way of saying, hey, we are Americans. We are Americans. You can call us African Americans all you want, but at the core, we are Americans. We help build this country. The second part, that arc between the separation between the blue and the red, that arc represents a new horizon. A new horizon. We are now free. Let's go forward from here. The third is the star in the center of the flag. That star has two meanings. The first meaning is Texas. If you don't know, Texas is the Lone Star State. Texas was its own country for 9 years, in case you don't know that. They were their own country for 9 years. So they were the Lone Star Republic. So that star represents Texas. But that star also represents the fact that we're adding our star to the United States flag. We as African Americans, no matter where we are part of the 50 stars now that goes on to that flag. We are Americans. And the last is that burst going around that star. That is called a starburst. That is a nova. A nova is the birth of a new star. So as African Americans coming out of slavery, this is a new beginning. This is a new life that we're going to be celebrating and hopefully having a chance to take advantage of. So how do most communities traditionally celebrate the Juneteenth holiday? 3 things we talk about. The first one you're doing right now. It's a gathering of family and friends. That's the first part. The second part is the flying of the emancipation flag, the Juneteenth flag. That's the second part. And the third part, well, the food trucks around here are going to really like the third part when I talk about the third part. Because the third part is the consumption of delicious Juneteenth foods. Red foods, and that's kind of why I'm standing here in the heat with all this red on. Red is the official color for Juneteenth. Go, sister. See you over there. Got red on. That's the official color of Juneteenth. And red foods are the most prominent feature of the Juneteenth menu. During Juneteenth celebration, you see strawberry soda, punch, hibiscus tea, red velvet cake, red beans and rice, even red fruits like strawberry and watermelon. The importance of red foods traced back to their culture is mainly the last ones that came into Texas on the transatlantic slave trade. And that was the Yoruba and the Congolese cultures. Those cultures held up the color red in high regard. It was a symbol for sacrifice, transition, and power. But barbecue is what really brought the community together. Juneteenth barbecue foods include pork, chicken, ribs, hot links, and brisket. Smoked, sauce-covered barbecue meats are also considered a red food. The historian Michael Twitty calls this the most important feature of the Juneteenth table, those barbecue meals. The side dishes consist of what they call prosperity meals. Cornbread, corn, collard greens, cabbage, black-eyed peas, pork, potatoes, yams, sweet potatoes. Hungry yet? Michael Twitty called collard greens and sweet potatoes as the main crops for the enslaved because they were easy for them to harvest and store in their cabins over the winter. Black-eyed peas and pork represented wealth. Collard greens bring good fortune, and corn symbolizes gold. But remember, there is no one way to celebrate Juneteenth. So I also use the history of Juneteenth to start my 4th stage out of the 5 stages from slavery to Juneteenth and beyond. And it's titled Juneteenth to True Emancipation. Now keep your ears open, because you're gonna learn some stuff here. Maybe you know it already. I'd be impressed if you do. So bear with me, I'm gonna add a little bit of history here. And sadly, I must inform you that the enslavement of African Americans did not truly end on 19 June 1865. Do not despair, we can still celebrate Juneteenth as the ending of slavery in the Confederate States, because that's what it actually was. Although rarely discussed in schools, and I know, because I'm a history teacher at Fort Dorchester High School, so I know what the books actually say, and they don't talk very much about this. It was actually Union slave states that had the last of the slaves. It was not states in the Confederate States of America that were the last to give up the enslaved Africans. It was states in the Union, not the Confederacy. They were called the border states. Those were states that were slave states that did not join the Confederacy when the war started. They remained part of the Union. So when the Emancipation Proclamation was written, it specifically said that all the enslaved people in states in rebellion against the Union must be set free. Those 5 border states, they were not in rebellion. So the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to them. They didn't have to allow their slaves to go free. So although you don't hear that very often, it's still true. So the final chapters of United States history took place in Delaware and Kentucky. As I said, Emancipation Proclamation did not affect them. Didn't affect any of those 5 Union border states, which were Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Virginia. Eventually, it was Kentucky and Delaware, the last ones to hold on to their enslaved Africans and refuse to release them until they were forced to do so with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. Now you think we're done, but we're not. Sadly, that wasn't the end of slavery in the United States, even though the border states let go of their slaves. Why is that? How is that possible? All of the states in the Union now have given up their slaves. Why do we still have slaves within the territory of the United States of America? Very simple. Not everybody who lived in the United States of America fell under the U.S. Constitution. Who was it in America that did not fall under the United States Constitution? Anybody want to shout out a guess? I don't blame you. The American Indians did not fall under the U.S. Constitution. And Indian tribes held as many as 10,000 enslaved Africans. So they continued to hold on to theirs after the 13th Amendment because it did not apply to them. The largest of this group was the Cherokee. The Cherokee had about 5,000 enslaved Africans that they held on to and refused to release. So it wasn't the Confederate states the last to give up the enslaved. It wasn't even the Union states. It was the American Indian who refused to give up their slaves. It was not until the U.S. government signed a treaty with the 5 civilized tribes, known as the Treaties of 1866, that we can really say the last of the enslaved Africans in America were set free. Who here is saying, I never heard that before? I don't blame you. I don't blame you. It's not a common part of our history. So now let's talk about the final stage of what I call the 5 stages from slavery to Juneteenth and beyond. And don't worry, this is my shortest stage. It's called the fight for a national holiday. So how did we end up with a national holiday? Perhaps no 2 people pushed the ideal more than activist and founder of the National Juneteenth Observance Foundation, the Reverend Dr. Ronald V. Myers Sr., who traveled to Washington, D.C. over 20 years lobbying lawmakers. But he died in 2018 and never saw his work come to fruition. But we also have 96-year-old Texan and community leader, Opal Lee, whom many consider the grandmother of Juneteenth. In 2016, at the age of 89, she began a walk from her home in Fort Worth, Texas, to Washington, D.C. to bring awareness to this important cause. During her walk, she gathered 1.5 million signatures on a petition asking the government to create a holiday named after Juneteenth. So in 2021, President Joe Biden finally designated June 19th as a federal holiday. And that's what we're here celebrating today.